Hi, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. So I am going to give an overview of research data management with REDCap, feature security, and just a touch on ethics. I should probably give a bit of background about who I am. So I started working for Vancouver Coastal Health Research Institute, which is a research institute within UBC. About a year ago, in a support role. Prior to that, I was a research associate. Most of my background is on the scientific computing side of things. So I've got the purpose of this presentation, I think, is more to give an overview of how we use REDCap, and I'll give you some possibly opinionated views of where I think REDCap fits in. If you go on the internet, there's lots of people using REDCap, and there's lots of different opinions, and I'm just going to give you mine. So I'll talk about the key features, what I think the roles and limitations are in research data management, just an example usage so we all know, so it's clear what I'm talking about, and then talk about system configuration, security considerations, and then touch on research ethics. So what is REDCap? So REDCap stands for Research Electronic Data Capture. It's a mature, secure web application for building, managing online surveys and databases. It's developed and owned by Vanderbilt University, and it's widely used. So thousands of institutions are using it, and many, many projects. You can go to those URLs if you're interested in the main site, and I've just ours, of course, you have to host it on your own URL, so this is the URL of the one at our research institute. REDCap can be used as part of clinical trials, so it's possible to set up a research process that is fully compliant with privacy legislation, but really its major plus is that it's got streamlined process for rapid development to create and design projects, and it's free for academic use by collaborating institutions. So I call it free like beer because it's not open source. What is the motivation? From a research data management perspective, some of the really nice things about REDCap is that you can house it on a secure server. For example, ours is housed at UBC IT Data Center. You set up your web servers properly, so using strong encryption, your users can be authenticated. You can track modifications to the data and undo them, and you can set it up so that it's backed up regularly. Rather than a lot of people are coming to REDCap from something like just using Excel. So another advantage apart from security is that you have one single copy of the data, so single repository, and everybody's using the same data. And you can access it from multiple different sites. As well, through the process of setting up your projects, you design your forms and define your variables using what they call a data dictionary. And that just encourages planning and proper design of your studies. So REDCap is often used as a survey tool. So participants can go and fill out online surveys, possibly anonymously. Other than that, a lot of people use it just for manual data entry using a web interface. And I'll show you some examples of the rapid development designer. And other key features are you can customize your user access levels depending on the role of users in your team. Again, you can track modifications and set up study arms. There's some support for secure file sharing. I know that is a problem at some institutions about how to get files, large files, from person to person. For security reasons, things should not be emailed. For example, user roles would be, you might have a project manager who sees all of the data except possibly identifiers. You can set it up so you have a physician who is able to see participant information such as patient name if it's a clinical study. And you can have data entry people who only see the data entered as forms and can't access anything else. Ultimately, the data is exported to something like a spreadsheet. And that's where you would do your analysis using standard other packages, Excel, SAS data. I just want to make the point, and I'll touch on this a few times. It's not a general purpose database system. When you export your data, it's essentially one spreadsheet. You can have linked data files, things like that, but they're not exported. Let's see. Okay, so I see REDCap as fitting into projects in a specific way. REDCap is very good at what it does, but it's not general purpose. Each project is like a spreadsheet. So if you've got complicated data models, I'll just run through the example of like a clinical study where you've got data that you need to hide, like patient name. You might have multiple tables. So for example, you're tracking blood pressure. You've got a table of blood pressure readings, and you want to go from like the outcomes of a patient to blood pressure. You can't do that in REDCap. That's not what it's for. There is workarounds that people use, is simply to set up multiple REDCap projects. So essentially, if you have multiple sheets on your Excel spreadsheet, you would have multiple projects within REDCap, and you can, but there's no enforced integrity. So a change or deletion in one area, it doesn't affect anything else. I'll touch on the technology behind REDCap and how to install it. But what's important to realize is it's not stored in a relational database model. It is stored in a database, uses MySQL as a backend, but database changes aren't part of the project. So users are free to create new projects, define their data, define their variables, but the database structure doesn't change, which is good. But in a sense, that's bad, because if you're interested in complicated data models, then you need to worry about that yourself. Where is it really good? Where you have a large number of users, they know their project quite well, and they just want to get their data in a nice central repository for all the other good things that gives you. And they're not looking for anything complicated, and they're going to export their data for reporting and statistical analysis. There's some differing opinion on REDCap calculations. Some groups that have teams to support modifications to REDCap have been very successful at extending REDCap in various ways. We're not in that situation, and I think personally the calculations, if they're more than something like converting between kilograms and pounds body weight, you might think about putting those elsewhere. It's intended as a data collection tool, and things like calculations aren't automatically updated like you would expect if you're used to something like Excel. I think I've touched on this mostly, so I'm just going to flip through a lot of my slides, and then we can have more discussion at the end. But I would say don't expect REDCap is going to solve a lot of problems in terms of managing complicated data. As well, some of the features, if you're really worried about data security, are not there. So if you're looking something like database level encryption, that you're going to want another tool. What I find really interesting about using REDCap is if you go back for a minute. If you want to integrate it into another tool, such as using, let's see, using REDCap to store your data and then run, say, R. Maybe you've got, R scripts that do some calculations you want. You don't have to export as a spreadsheet, run your R tools, get your result, push it back into REDCap. It's possible through the API to automate this in a secure fashion. So, to my mind, REDCap fits into a larger system like this. So, if you install REDCap, you've got a web server and a database. They can be on the same machine. The security standard at UBC is that they reside on different machines because this one is, the web server is world-facing. So if attackers get on this machine, they don't get your data. And as part of this architecture, I've added things like you can load R scripts and do your calculations on the back end here, pull in other data. For example, I've been working on machine-to-machine transfer data through something like Fitbit. You can get that into your system and push summarized results back to REDCap because it's got a really good interface that is easy for people to use. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes showing you what it actually looks like. So there's lots of tutorials, or we can always schedule another session on how to actually use it. But this is just a screenshot of a web page. So again, all your interactions with REDCap are through the website. So an administrator like me has created a project. You want to do surveys, so you just click through a couple of the things, enable surveys, and then go to the online designer. Once you've got an online designer, you can add new fields, which then creates new databases, creates new variables in your project. And this is the list of the types of variables that are available, pretty well corresponding to the standard widgets that you'd find on a web page. And you can, if you want to get more complicated, you can insert results from SQL queries and some other nice widgets. Down here, you've got you type in the text, it's going to show up on your instructions to the user, give it a variable name, and you can say whether the variable is required, can they submit the form if they haven't filled it out, and whether it's an identifier, such as a name that you want to hide. Easy to configure things like where you have a bunch of choices. So in this case, it's a drop-down list for a single answer for sex with your choices, and it's just integer, comma, and then description. Again, the standard variable name is required as an identifier, and then you get and then back to design view. So you can reorder your variables, you can add new fields, you can add branching logic is available here. I won't get into that this session, but if you want to hide fields based on, for example, sex, you could just go through the interface that's offered from branching logic. So this would be the data entry view from your research workers or research workers would enter data. This is a popular way to enter things. For example, if you have paper-based forms and you want to hire or you get people to enter data as data entry people, they can't see a lot of the other tools and everything, but they can enter things. Things are available, and this is the corresponding view from a web page. So if you wanted to send a public survey, all that happens is you would distribute the URL, including the unique tag for the survey. REDCap has some good tools for automating a lot of this, but you don't need to use them. There are cases that REDCap doesn't handle as well, where you just want to print this out on a piece of paper, or you could reduce it using something like bit.ly or tinyURL, and do it that way. As long as they get to your site at that URL, you'll get the data. So managing, one of the quite nice things about REDCap is that it allows you to manage survey participants. So after clicking through a couple of things, like enabling your instrument as a survey, then this option appears on the side. You click on that, and then you get an interface where you can load, where you can load lists of emails if you have them, or that sort of thing. REDCap is a little bit quirky, so they had a particular workflow in mind when this was designed. So even if you don't intend to email any of the surveys, you have to go through a couple of steps. So you'd write an email you wish to send as if it's going to come from the system, and REDCap is configured so that it comes from your institutional account. For example, it comes from my UBC account, and you can make a nice web page, email. And thing to bear in mind is you have to fill this out even if you never use it. So in order to have the button enabled to carry on with what you actually want to do, sometimes you have to go through a couple of steps. But there's only a handful of these quirks that, and lots of them are documented online with tips and things like that. So it's not much of a hurdle. So then you can get to this page, and here's your public URL if you want anonymous, or you can enter your participant list, etc. And then, yeah, this is still the view that your participants will see. Once you've got your data, it's going to show up as something like this within REDCap. There's some support for sorting or creating reports, but not great in depth, but probably good enough for most cases. And then you'll need to export it for analysis. Yeah, if you look online, there's some argument about whether calculations ought to be in REDCap or not. I'd say it depends a lot on the team, the expertise that you have on hand. I suggest that there are better tools, and that's the direction I've gone. Very familiar with using R, and there's lots of other support for niche statistical analysis or loading tables, looking up demographics, that kind of thing for calculations. So, other features that are quite important to people in projects I've dealt with. There is a mobile app. So if you need to go, for example, in the field and you don't have a live network, you can install a mobile app. Data is entered via what looks like the same website, but the data is stored locally. You get back on the network, you push all your data back to the server. You can enable something called double data entry. If you want higher confidence that your data is entered correctly, you can set it up so that two workers have to enter the identical data, that kind of thing. Data tracking. So if you allow people to make changes, you can set it up so that the changes don't become permanent until they're approved by like a manager type role. And you can enforce people to enter comments and logs about changes, things like that. And data access groups. So one of the great strengths of REDCap is using it to by multiple different sites spread geographically. So you can set up your user roles so that users at multiple different sites only see the data that they entered. It's less confusing. Possibly there's privacy restrictions, as well as you can also, of course, create manager-level kind of roles that can still see everything. So that's another feature that's widely used. I'll touch on system configuration and security. I think this is comments I've heard about REDCap in use at other institutions. This is kind of important. So REDCap is easy to install and maintain, but you shouldn't underestimate the amount of time and effort for the system as a whole. The example for the REDCap system at VCHRI, so that's at UBC, we have about 100 projects in a couple of different stages. Production is where you're supposed to be entering live data. A lot of projects just end up staying in development because that's good enough for some people. So a lot of these are actually in production use, but they choose not to go into production. So looking at the number of users, so there's about 140 active users now. Non-active users or suspended users are typically people who have left the project, but you want to keep a record of the changes that they made. So they can't log in anymore, but we still have records of their data. A very large number of fields and records. It all fits onto a fairly small amount of disk space. So the MySQL database is less than 3 gigabytes. It's gone up a bit since then, but because you're not adding huge files or images, it's mostly text data, the databases tend to be very small, and that makes it very nice for support because you can, there's lots of tools for things like copying projects, things like that. So just in terms of support, for adding users, helping them get set up with new projects, I estimate it's taken me about 5 hours per week, kind of half to a day a week over the 2 months that I took records. The problem, so that's just support. So if you're thinking about the costs of a REDCap installation, if you've got a somewhat experienced sysadmin who's familiar with REDCap, it's not going to be a costly thing to do. The software is free of cost. It's not open source. I think one of the problems and why there's a proliferation of REDCap installations is that you license, it's a fairly restrictive license. You have to become a member of the consortium by submitting an application, and this is from the agreement. So you need a signatory who routinely commits to legal contracts. So that can be this kind of person. Often what happens is departments will get a license. Vanderbilt doesn't like individual labs getting a license just because of the number of instances that end up out there. But it seems to be fairly easy to get a license. And then you end up with a very large number of systems. People come and go. People get grad students to set it up, and then people forget where it's housed and things like that. And our backups being done, all of that sort of thing. So possible solution is to, if you can't get an institution-wide license, is to think about adding smaller scope licenses and possibly sharing the same server. So you could have the same sysadmin organizing backups, making sure users are doing what they should be doing, but you don't need to try to get a, the VP of research at your university to sign something because for practical reasons that might be almost impossible to get. So that's one thought. Technically, it's a PHP web application. PHP is a very widely used programming language for the web. Typically, people would install it using something like the Apache web server, which is an open source free web server with a MySQL database backend. Again, MySQL, everybody's probably familiar with, widely used no-cost database. And just a caveat that the data is not stored in SQL. So if you want to generate reports from the data directly from the database, it becomes a little bit problematic, but I'm sure there's people who have done it. And then you integrate it with your email server as you normally do. Your regular email. You don't need to set up an email server on REDCap. Security recommendations. I've just love a couple of notes about my experience. Budgets are all seem fairly low in research these days. A lot of people just trying to get stuff up and get their work done. If you have a domain registered, you can expect that it's going to be attacked pretty well as soon as it's up. You've heard in public, there's been some big attacks involving extortion. So attackers get on, encrypt all your data, and want to be paid to get it unencrypted, or they're just going to try to embarrass you. REDCap is intended for health-related studies. So if you are possibly holding data that might be tracked in an individual, you're open to extortion. They'll release your data and embarrass you. There's looking at the logs of some server I maintained elsewhere where there's at a lab where there's intellectual property. There's just attacks continuously. And then, of course, there's always malice. People inside or outside just want to make life difficult. So realize that if you're putting a website up, it's probably going to be attacked almost immediately. Attackers are sophisticated these days, and that's why you should not do it yourself. I highly recommend calling on IT support or some kind of professional to get the base system set up. I use Ubuntu Linux, and there's lots of good tools to open and close firewalls as part of the software, so that your software firewalls, obvious, just things like turn off the software you're not using, install intrusion detection. So if you do get attacked and they want to put up an illegal website selling ringtones or something, you can immediately notice that. And then just the obvious things that that come to mind. Use reasonable passwords and think about restricting IP addresses for the connecting machines. A good security recommendation is to use 2 servers. So if one is compromised, you haven't lost everything. We use a separate machine for the web server, which is exposed to the world, and the database server, which houses the data. And there's special software configuration worries for each of those, which just makes life a lot easier and lowers your risk. So for example, your database, by default, depending on which software you use, it's going to be accessible from the world. You can turn that off. You can ensure proper passwords. There's varying opinions on whether you ought to be enabling software to only connect from specific machines or really good passwords, that kind of thing. Also, you need to plan for disaster recovery. So where your backups, they've got to be planned to happen. You've got to check that they actually do happen. So if you're a sysadmin, you've got something like cron jobs running, which just automatically run. And you've got to actually spend the time to test that your backups can recover your database. In the news, there was some people who should have known better that lost pretty well their whole project because they thought they were doing backups and they actually weren't. And disaster struck through somebody's deleting the wrong directory, and they lost 300 gigabytes of data that were non-recoverable. One of the key points of weakness that we worry about with REDCap is user accounts. There are multiple ways to set up user accounts. We use what REDCap calls a table-based system. So the user accounts stand completely independently from the rest of the world. So at VCHRI, we serve the research needs of UBC investigators, but also people who are more clinicians. They're part of the Research Institute, but they mostly have other email systems. So we set them up separately, set their passwords. I always ask for institutional emails, and I would strongly recommend the two-step authentication, which you get a text message if you want to change your password to confirm your identity. The biggest point of weakness is phishing attacks. So people will randomly get emails from attackers that look like they're real. They'll click on them, data will be installed on their local machine, which gives them access to everything on their local machine. Well, the data's not stored there anymore, which is great. They can't just suck up your Excel spreadsheets with all your data, but they can also request passwords from your email account if they get access. Your institutional email will be run by professionals, so they ought to have set up defenses for that kind of attack. But there's no guarantee. So I ask for institutional email, and before I reset somebody's password, I try to contact them in some other way to make sure it's legitimate and I'm not giving access to the project data just because I got a request for a password reset. Okay, I've just got a couple of slides here on research ethics. This is always a big topic, and it comes back to really what do we want to do with our software systems. We want to be efficient, effective with the highest efficacy. We're talking about usually health-related research, so there's humans involved. So your institution is going to have a review board, and they're going to decide what standards.
Hi, Chris. I just want to interrupt. Your audio seems to be cutting in and out a little bit. I wonder if your microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe just.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. So maybe continue on. But yeah, you might be covering your finger with it when you're.
Okay,
speaking,
I'll hold by the wire.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for letting me know.
No problem. Sorry.
Let's see. So yeah, the best software in the world isn't going to protect you from bad process. So the way you do your research, the administrators of the keepers of the user accounts and the passwords can't protect you if your workers are all using a shared computer and they're all using the same account. So I recommend that REDCap or any other software system be seen as part of your research process, and it's up to the PI to determine whether what role the software is going to take. And I say I do not curate or manage the data, and I'll help. I mean, obviously I want to help get research done, but I can't accept responsibility for deciding whether access restrictions are appropriate. Other groups have other data centers or take on a bigger role, but just that's the way that I've approached these things. So I typically tell people that I'm the sysadmin, and then I'll help train and help on your project where appropriate. So one of the things that comes up, just broader discussion of handling research ethics and privacy, is risk analysis. So what goes in your database, you really need to think about as in, well, for sure, what have you committed to? People have volunteered to be part of your study. What is your agreement with them? So if you've got personal identifiers, typically you have to list on the team who's going to see them. one problem with, or one limitation of REDCap is that there's only one class of identifier. So you would mark things, obviously names, dates of birth. If you store them, those are identifiers, but you can't turn off one or the other. You can't have two types of identifiers, one of which is, say, postal code and occupation. Maybe that's part of your study, which is kind of it is an identifier because you can work backwards and figure out who those people are if you were determined, but it's not a primary identifier like a name. So REDCap has an all or nothing, is an identifier or not. You can have data access groups to restrict subsets of data, but not subsets of variables. You could leave out your identifiers, but that might actually break your requirements. If you're doing a clinical study, there might actually be an ethical requirement to rapidly re-identify people if problems are identified as part of the research, and you need to go back and notify people that something needs to be done, they need to talk to the doctor. That can come up. But it's part of a discussion that's much bigger than what software you use. If you want to be super careful, or for convenience, you might store it locally on an Excel spreadsheet, but it's higher risk because typically workstations aren't held to the same standard as servers. And you might be at a higher risk from a phishing attack of losing your data. You could store it separately on REDCap so that if an attacker got on your system, it's going to take much more effort to figure out which are the identifiers that go with this project because they're stored separately but in the same software system. Or you could store it handwritten on paper and lock it in a filing cabinet. But that makes things slow, and as part of your process, where grad students and postdocs often are a large part of the research project, or PIs who change institutions, it's practically difficult, and there's the risk of loss of the primary data simply because it's harder to track and back up, etc. So that, in a nutshell, is my overview of using REDCap. It can be a good part of a research data management system. I found that it is very good at its intended purpose, which is capturing data that would be entered by humans. It's got lots of features for that, and it's reliable. I've found that users are typically able to just go online, learn, and use the system without much guidance or training. There are lots of good features, such as securely sharing files between remote groups that can be difficult, and some institutions don't have infrastructure in place for that. But you really need, if you want to install it, there's going to be some time for training and getting up to speed on effectively using it. And I would rely on IT professionals as to what your security standards ought to be. Some groups extensively modify it and add new features. Of course, that depends on your funding model, and you know, there's no. I don't want to get into language wars, but which unfortunately programmers tend to get into. It is in PHP. I find that most people at universities are scientific programmers, not necessarily web developers, so something like Python or R is what they're more experienced in. So again, if you want to make REDCap a bigger part of your system, you might want to look at very carefully at whether you want to get trained in PHP or whether you want to get trained in using something like a application programming interface, which you can do through various languages, and then make REDCap a part of a larger system. Yeah, so that's my questions. Sorry about the audio. I hope you guys could hear enough of it, and I can answer questions now.
Great. So we've got one that's been typed into the group chat. from Eugene Barsky, and he's asking what could be the avenues to connect REDCap to a data access system, for example, Dataverse or DSpace, and he's speaking of final data sets for this.
Sure. It's quite easy. With REDCap, as part of setting up your project, you create a data dictionary, and in the data dictionary, you enter all the text that the user is going to need, the participant is going to need to enter the data. So you're going to define all your data types up front in a spreadsheet, in the system, and then enter data. Both the data set and the data are exportable as spreadsheets. And so the problem then is to map your data types to something in external software like Dataverse. But because you've had to go through the effort of defining your variables and then picking out what type of variable they are, such as free-form text or yes, no, most of the work has already been done. I'm optimistic that you could write some kind of script that would automatically transfer a REDCap project directly into Dataverse, but there isn't. With your follow-up question, there's no metadata standard. Ideally, people ought to be entering some kind of universal description of their data types, their variables, but that's not required, and people won't do it. So you're going to face the problem in each project of doing that conversion. For people not as familiar with the problem of metadata, this is a problem where something like age. In my project, it's entered in years, and it's a decimal, so 4.5 years is 4.5 years. Some people might enter it as at months. And I might name it age. I might name it age_YRS because it's in years, and there's no way to automatically transform that into something that's going to be understandable by another system. It sounds trivial, and if you're coming from a background where the data is very deep, like genomics, you might think, well, it's not a big deal. You haven't got that many data variables. More the social sciences or clinical observational trials, I've seen projects with 500 variables. So it's no longer a simple matter of I'm just going to go and write down at the end of the project or publication or whatever what my variables mean. That means it's almost you need to think about it in your project time frame and plan for it. Yeah.
Okay, great. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to either type them in the group chat, or you can unmute and just speak them verbally. We don't have any questions that have come in via email yet. If people need a reminder of that email address, it's info@westgrid.ca, info@westgrid.ca.
Hi, Chris. It's Scott at the Genome Sciences Center. We've met before. So I wanted to see if you had any experience using the REDCap API to do a transfer between two REDCap systems. So in the model that we're considering using, we wanted to have a less secured one that would be not containing any personal identifiable information at all, and it would sit more public-facing. And then a secondary server that would have the more clinical data that would be behind the firewall and be more restricted. And then to allow that to contain the necessary data between a clinical study survey to actually use the API to transfer between the two. Have you ever tried anything like that?
Yeah. What I've done is I've run into a situation where the statistics that need to be calculated are complicated. And it's complicated enough I had to write an R script. So what I didn't want to have to keep re-downloading data, so I use the API, and you get a spreadsheet of the data. You can also get a spreadsheet of the metadata. and then you can make your changes. In this case, I was doing calculations, and then I push back the values, in this case, into the same project. I've also used, but it's essentially the same as going through the manual process of downloading your data dictionary to a CSV file, downloading your data to the CSV file, and then re-importing it. And I've done that several times, moving some projects from CFRI to VCH's server. The only problem in REDCap is that you can't export the project details. So if your projects are simple, it's almost trivial to move the data dictionary, like your metadata and your data, from one instance to another. The problem is you have to set up all the user accounts, you have to reset up the time points and scheduling, that kind of thing. But I think if you're just wanting to mirror data, it should be very straightforward.
This would be more mirroring part of the data. So it would be like, say there's a project on the public one, and it had, you know, some information. We want to add that to a master one that had a lot more.
Yeah. So their API supports doing things in bulk or column at a time. So the most general way to do it is you end up just connecting to the server through the API, and then sending essentially text, which is record variable value, and it will just update the database as you go. So it's very straightforward.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course, we're both in Vancouver. I'm happy to meet up sometime if you'd like a demo or something.
Oh, I might take you up on that.
Yeah. So the only kind of caveat with that is you'll need something like Python because it's using a decent API that you'd use for web services, where you need to worry about sending the secure token, so things are done with SSL and all that kind of stuff. You have to pass your data in XML and receive it and stuff like that.
Yeah, I figured it would need that. That's great. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions? Feel free to unmute or type in the group chat. One more check of the email, and I don't see anything coming through quite yet. Okay, we might want to maybe wrap it up there then, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know if you have any last closing words, Chris?
Oh, I'd just say, yeah, feel free to email me with questions. Can't promise a long reply, but I try to be helpful and connect with the community.